Since 2011, Libya has not merely descended into total violence and social fragmentation, but has also come to be dominated by various armed groups who profit from the political turmoil. Think tanks observe that armed groups rely on a wide range of illegal activities and economic practices to finance themselves and co-opt their allies, including corruption, extortion, confiscation of private properties, smuggling of oil refined products, and capital flight to foreign countries. The prevailing narrative argues that these activities have been gradually destroying the country's formal economy. Local armed groups have begun to compensate for the inability of the state to provide resources, services, and most importantly, security to the population. Tripoli, the capital city, has witnessed the emergence of a Mexico-like cartel, where four militias have allied in order to establish the basis for a functioning monopoly of violence. From 2012 to early 2014, the primary source of finance for militias was funds specifically allocated from the Defense and Interior Ministries, which covered the salaries of individual militiamen. By inflating payrolls and operating expenditures, militia leaders and their political allies were able to accumulate wealth and went on to partly reinvest it in heavy weapons and other capital-intensive equipment, thus perpetuating the vicious cycle of violence. However, as state funding contracted, armed groups started to search for alternative sources of funding, becoming embedded in the socio-economic structures. So, that sounds like some sort of bleak alternative future, but that is present-day Libya.
When was that released? That's quite interesting.
That is a good question. When was that released? That is from a 2020 article.
Yeah.
So,
Story
with that,
time.
welcome to Modern Guild. As we mentioned in our previous episode, we're trying something out where we're going to open episodes with little paragraphs or anecdotes, maybe monologues, you could say, which
ditties.
hints at little ditties, which hint at the topic or subject matter somewhat for to come for the current episode. So if you're with us, thank you for listening once again. We hope that you find some of this enjoyable. We're recording on a Tuesday morning.
2 days before the inauguration kicks off in the States.
Yes.
Martin Luther King Day over there, keeping the markets closed.
Yeah, much to our dismay. But we had a sort of pathetic chat before we started recording about the pain that public holidays in the United States causes us, with the market staying open for a long weekend and not being able to check in on some juicy gains.
I mean, at least it's Martin Luther King Day. At least it's that and not something fucking...
Thanksgiving.
Yeah, if it was something else, I don't know what the public holidays are like over there, but I'm sure there's like just horrible public holidays here where you just like sit there and grimace at
way to alienate a third of our audience. Hey, we fucking suck. We're like, oh yeah, by the way, public holidays in the US suck.
I think there's a merit for like being anti-public holidays that keeps high-powered entertainment like the stock market closed, but also pro not going to work. So balance those two out.
Yeah. I think an ideal alternative to this would be like rolling public holidays for 1/5 of the population.
Yeah.
Or like once a fortnight, 10% of the population gets an extra day off.
Just like a
sounds good
bank where you can just, because it's kind of fucked up that like everybody has to take the day off, like it'd be much nicer to sort of like bank that in your little like public holiday
wallet.
Your little
in your
allowed
Ethereum blockchain wallet.
Oh god, it's so bleak. These are the days that you get to own.
Yeah. I love how often our suggestions just sort of derail into weird laws that we would impose if we somehow fell into like becoming dictators or authoritarian controllers of our own states.
I mean, it's ideally coming at some point. I'm like occasionally daydream about that as I walk around.
I do, yeah.
Yeah.
I'd like to be a dictator.
Oh yeah, totally. Especially when I come across like annoying little indignities as I go about my day, you know. I'm struggling to come up with an example right now. Like just shit like, you know, getting fined like $300 if you have a beer in your hand or stuff like that. It's just fucking obnoxious.
That is pretty fucking disgusting.
That is an indignity, you know. That's bullshit.
On Saturday night, I went to this rainforest near the Gold Coast in Queensland, and it's like a small hike to this cave called Natural Bridge, where there's like a really beautiful waterfall, and in this cave there are like glowworms. So, you know, you hike down there in the dark, and it's really like quiet, and all you can hear is like the rush of the water and the sounds of the rainforest, which is like, you know, pretty serene, pretty beautiful. So you like, you know, have a headlamp, but, you know, you're basically just walking through the dark, and there's not that many people there because it's late at night. And we were like, you know, halfway through this small hike, we had witnessed some like nice wildlife, saw like some frogs and lizards and shit. And then we like turned the corner to just find this pack of like 11 teenagers just like completely decimating our serenity. Just like screaming and cackling, like all with their fucking smartphones out, just like taking photos and like watching like TikToks.
Oh, dude.
Just like standing like across the entire path, and we kind of approached them and had to just like weave through them, and they smelled of body odor, and it was repulsive. And if I was a dictator, I would have someone at the entrance to the rainforest issuing permits based on like your whether or not you would be suitable to occupy space in the rainforest, and if you were likely to detract from the serenity, then you would not receive a permit.
That should be fair, right? Like, you know, because that's horrible, man. That's what like set off Ted Kaczynski. Well, I mean, it was like a little bit more hardcore because they bowled some of his trees that he liked.
Yeah, but just the destruction of serenity as a rule.
Oh, it's so horrendous, eh? You know, especially playing TikToks in the middle of a rainforest like that is pretty disgusting.
That's like peak dystopia, and that's what we do at Modern Guilt. But luckily for all of us, that is not peak dystopia, but something that comes close to peak dystopia is Libya, which we can talk about a little bit. So
hit me with it.
Last week, you recommended that I watch the documentary Hypernormalization, which I absolutely went ahead with, and it was fucking outstanding. So thanks for the recommendation.
No worries.
And as I'm sure you recall, like there is some Libya-related content in there, and Libya is like a country and a...
Can I interject quickly?
Yeah, please do.
What was your opinion of Gaddafi before you watched Hypernormalization?
Well, I already knew quite a bit about Gaddafi before Hypernormalization, and I had a largely neutral opinion on him. I think, like, prior to watching the doco, I was well aware of the many positive things that he had done, which actually aren't explored that thoroughly in Hypernormalization.
Yeah.
They more focus on his sort of like, kind of like semi-celebrity cult figure, eccentric status. More than the sort of value that he actually created for Libya and African and Middle Eastern countries more broadly.
Apparently, I don't know if this is true,
but
allegedly had multiple seizures with Gaddafi's doctor.
That's dope.
This is such a fucking bizarre, like I don't know if this is legit or not, but the guy claimed to be Gaddafi's doctor. So it's during a time where I was like hanging out pretty intensely with the Muslim community up in Auckland. And there's a guy who had refugee status and come from Libya and was allegedly Gaddafi's doctor, according to the bulk of the Muslim community and himself, of course. And it was really interesting. He was telling me a lot about like the good stuff that Gaddafi's done and like, you know, the atrocities that he had been accused of, but was largely bullshit. You know, and whatnot. And the guys seemed pretty adamant on... I mean, the problem is, like, a lot of that community was, like, very steeped in conspiracy theories and...
or, like, anti-Western sentiment.
Understandably.
Yeah.
But yeah.
100%.
You know, like, anyway, I don't know entirely where I was going to go with that. But yeah, man, like, it was fucking fascinating to hear. The guy apparently had to, like, escape Libya by the, you know, as fast as possible to get out of there right when the state was collapsing.
So, like, he left, like, just post-revolution, or, like, as the revolution was happening and the West intervened?
Yeah. As the revolution was happening, and just managed to get into New Zealand, you know.
Yeah, right. That's
I don't know anything
pretty
really about
extraordinary.
him before then, but yeah, he definitely changed my mind a bit. So go on.
No, don't be sorry at all. It's that's a fucking awesome story.
Yeah.
So as I said, like, Libya is a country that I've been pretty interested in for a long time. Back in 2011, when, you know, the Arab Spring was happening, I followed all of that really closely, because, you know, international politics and political science and whatnot is just something that I have been really interested in for my whole life, essentially.
Yep.
And then, you know, I've followed the narrative of post-revolution / intervention Libya, and then also have read a lot about Gaddafi, the character, and his kind of history. But hypernormalization did a really good job of sort of illustrating Libya as the sort of like fulcrum of this seesaw, of, in a sense, of you know, kind of imperialism on one side, and I suppose resistance, or I don't want to use the word justice because that's subjective, but, you know, attempts at justice on the other side. So I went and found a couple of journal articles to read in preparation for the pod, which are interesting because they kind of each represent one side of that kind of ideological seesaw that Libya stands as the center of. And the first one is by this guy called Dirk van der Waal, and it's called After Gaddafi, the Surprising Success of the New Libya. And this one was written in 2012, so only around 18 months, I think, after the fall of Gaddafi. And for the listeners who aren't super familiar with the situation in Libya, I'll give like a brief sort of history off the top of my head, just to catch people up so this all makes a bit more sense. So essentially, like, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi led a revolution in Libya in, I think, 1967 to overthrow the king of Libya, who had been in power since Libya broke free from the yoke of colonialism in 1950. So there was a period of post-colonial adjustment where Libya had its independence, and essentially the king didn't do a good enough job of ruling the country in the view of a lot of people. So Gaddafi led a small coup and seized power and implemented a sort of revolutionary socialist regime that wasn't strictly socialist in the Soviet sense, but it adhered to Gaddafi's own personal sort of political theory, which he called the Third Universal Theory, or the Third Way. And he ended up publishing his own manifesto called the Green Book, which was eventually circulated in schools and sort of institutions in Libya. And it described a political vision where the state controlled capital, but it was sort of on behalf of the people, if that makes sense. And so there was like a lot of central planning and top-down command, but at the same time, direct democracy. So people at like an individual, community, tribal, or regional level were encouraged to have as much sort of autonomy and say in the governance of their land and their affairs as they wanted to. So they could essentially, if they wanted, they could sit back and let the state do its thing, and they could be appointed a job by the state, go and work in a state-run oil field, and then live in state housing and receive a state salary, and everything would be managed for them. But if they wanted, they could also go about their business and sort of engage in private enterprise to a certain degree, as long as that's what their sort of like community supported. And another thing that Gaddafi was really pro was colonial or neo-colonial resistance. So Libya, like a lot of former colonies in northern Africa and the Middle East, was oil rich, and still is. And he realized that like oil could be politicized and turned into a weapon to resist the imperialism of the West. So when he seized power, he started to artificially restrict the production of oil and encouraged other countries who were in similar situations to Libya, like Algeria and Sudan and Iraq, to do similar things. So, which is a large part of what led to the oil crisis of 1971 or 72. Can you recall which year that was?
No, not at all. I can look it up.
Oh, that's
but that's
okay.
A good date range, you know.
Yeah. We'll give our listeners some autonomy, and they can fact check it if they want to. We can drop a resource in the episode description outlining the oil crisis. So essentially, as well as encouraging countries to weaponize their oil exports, Gaddafi went a step further and started supporting groups who were pushing for radical regime change in former colonies, like in Angola, Chad, South Africa, for example, arming militant groups and funding rebels and think tanks and the publication of material and all that sort of stuff that would build resistance against democratic capitalist governments who were either backed and put in place by the West post-independence from their former colonial masters. So, as you can imagine, Gaddafi's attempt at supporting these, quote, freedom fighters from his position didn't go down very well with the United States and the United Kingdom and whatnot. So, from the sort of mid-70s onwards, they started to directly oppose the Libyan regime through proxy wars in the countries where Libya was supporting resistance movements, and also by funding groups who were attempting to undermine the Libyan regime on the ground in Libya. So, yeah, you look like you're about to ask a question.
Oh, I just kind of like you know, like you hear about that sort of stuff a lot, but when you think about what's actually happening, it's just so fucking mind-blowing to me that the government would step in and, you know, directly fund resistance to another country's affairs.
Yeah.
Do you know how hard it is to get funding? Like, do you know how hard it is to get someone to believe in your vision? And to have a government step in and directly fund someone fucking up another state, country, whatever, is just mind-blowing to me,
Yeah, it is mind-blowing. Like, you know, it's in complete contravention to international law. It throws the idea of sovereignty out the window. Like, can you imagine if, and I mean, to an extent, this might happen presently, but can you imagine if Russia or Iran were funneling hundreds of millions of dollars to support a separatist group in the United States?
Like Antifa.
Well, yeah. I don't think Antifa receive foreign funding because they're too fucking hopeless. They're useless.
Yeah.
But, you know...
Capitol Hill, funded by...
yeah.
Can you
Brought
imagine
to you by Russia.
Fucking that boomer who was on Nancy Pelosi's desk receiving funding from the Kremlin?
Yeah. Not fucking happening, man.
Yeah. It'd be funny if they did, though. Like, that would be hilarious if they're all, you know...
Yeah.
Agents.
Actually, funny that we mentioned this, because something that I didn't know that was brought up in hypernormalization is Gaddafi's support for not the Black Panthers, but the Nation of Islam in the United States.
Yeah, I forgot about
which
that.
I thought was really interesting. So I mean, it did happen.
But they're like a separatist movement, Nation of Islam. They're like a full-blown segregationist from memory.
I think the Nation of Islam. Actually, I don't know enough about them to say it on the pod. I was going to say that I think they wanted to return to Africa. But I think I'm thinking of Marcus Garvey,
right?
Who was maybe not affiliated. So I'm not going to go into that. We can maybe try and do that another time.
I'll also clarify that. I know there is a separatist movement and like a black segregationist group.
Yeah.
I can't remember. I thought it was like Nation of Islam, but it might be another group. On the fringe.
So anyway, from the mid-70s onwards, you had this proxy war happening between Libya and the resistance or freedom movements that it was supporting, and then the crushing opposition from the United States and the rest of the West. And it's really interesting to think about this in the context of what was happening in Libya as this was going on, because Gaddafi had increased the standard of living, and I shouldn't just say Gaddafi, his regime had increased the standard of living in Libya to be, I think, the most sort of, by most developmental standards, the most successful country in North Africa. He raised the life expectancy from 50 to 65. Oil revenue was, I think, reached the point of $160 billion a year, not inflation adjusted. So like an enormous revenue. He started infrastructure projects, building like a really advanced system of roads to connect the major coastal cities in Libya with the tribal regions. And in order to try and diversify the economy, also had like a man-made river made going far south into the Libyan desert. And I think in the end, that project didn't prove to be that successful just because of the nature of trying to farm in a desert. It's insanely hard, even if you have water. But nonetheless, he was ambitious and had like a huge level of support amongst the Libyan people.
Oh, context as well is like, a lot of people probably won't appreciate how important connecting the territories are to the main cities in the Middle East, because part of why Islam was so successful was it was built around uniting the Cabal, which is like tribes within the Middle East, together under the umbrella of Islam. Because before that, it was just like lots of warring factions for, multiple decades, maybe centuries or whatever. And that's like kind of like a central part of unity within the Middle East. So you can imagine why anyone who does that is generally like, in the good books.
Yeah, absolutely.
All that time at the mosque really served me well.
Yeah, no, it fucking did, man. And like that's something that I actually appreciate about Islam and the Middle East, because I guess when you talk about the Middle East, it's also important to recognize that there are like a lot of minority religions, like Christian groups in Libya, for example, and blah blah blah. But like historically, society in the Middle East ran on a system of like patronage and tribute, and the development and maintenance of tribal loyalties sort of through the relationships between like elders and people of importance and wisdom in the community. So when Gaddafi was developing this physical infrastructure in Libya, it was almost a metaphor for the connections that tied the country together. So when the coastal elites in Libya needed the sort of backing or the approval of the tribal leaders in the regional areas for everything to work, and it was like a reciprocal relationship. So even though Gaddafi sort of ran an authoritarian regime, it was based on the understanding that he had the approval of these of the tribes and all of the different groups, and everything sort of worked somewhat harmoniously. And there was obviously harsh crackdowns against dissident groups, but it's up for debate, I think, whether or not that was an inherent part of his regime, or if that was the equivalent first of what you could call teething problems. So like obviously when you rise to power or try and seize power in a coup, assuming your motives are pure, there will be things you need to do to consolidate power in order to achieve your ends. Obviously, like if that involves violence and the smiting or wiping out of dissident groups, that's horrible. But I think there would come a point where once power is consolidated, that probably doesn't become very necessary, except for in the instances in which these groups are being backed or supported by outside interests, a la the United States, United Kingdom, France, in which that support for those groups...
Did you mean, within what context did you mean Allah?
Oh, sorry, not Allah as in God. I mean...
Gotcha. All right.
Allah, like that of...
I was like, oh, okay, I haven't heard about that yet.
Like, yeah, Allah is the United States.
Yeah, fair enough.
And if you... Thinking about Gaddafi, the regime's cracking down of dissident groups supported by outside interests, the support of those groups has the dual function of destabilizing the country, but then also being able to say to the world, look, this authoritarian regime cracks down on dissidents. So you delegitimize the regime in the eyes of the world because you see them brutally crushing these groups that you are actually supporting.
It's just fucking bullshit spin from the West, though.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because they could spin that either way if they want.
So post the sort of rapid economic development of Libya leading up to the mid to late 70s, the West started supporting these groups and also imposing crippling economic sanctions, which became the foundation for unrest in Libya. And there is a lot of sort of episodes that constitute this era, but I'm going to fast forward over them because I think the specificities aren't important to get to the larger point. But essentially, inflation started running rampant. There were sanctions placed on the country to stop the importation of equipment necessary for the production of oil, which started to create a chokehold on their main source of income. Governments like the government of Saudi Arabia and Egypt was starting to turn on the Libyans at the behest of the United States. And by the mid-2000s, the country was essentially broken. Unemployment among young people reached, I think, a point of 30%. And then when the sort of powder keg of the Arab Spring exploded in 2010 or early 2011, Libya was ripe to go off, essentially. So the Libyan people rose up, claimed that they wanted to overthrow Gaddafi, and then NATO, led by the United States, under the guise of humanitarian intervention, started bombing the shit out of Libya.
Yeah.
And as Hillary Clinton famously once said, they came, they saw, he died. Gaddafi was brutally dragged out of a car on a highway as his convoy was fleeing to his tribal homeland, and he was beaten to death in the middle of the road on social media, and his corpse was tied to the back of a fucking...
I remember that, eh? That was right around the time Saddam Hussein was also killed, right?
I think it was later, but I mean, same rough period. But say all that to say, that was actually a very long overview that took far too long.
Yeah.
It's hilarious, this article going back to by Dirk van der Wal, titled "After Gaddafi, the Surprising Success of the New Libya."
Oh, yeah, right.
is written in the context of Gaddafi has just been killed. The country has been bombed to shit by fucking Western fighter jets.
Yep.
Thousands of airstrikes. The cities are decimated. The roads connecting them to regional areas are largely destroyed, and the entire country has fallen into factionalism and control by militias, as I described in that paragraph that we opened this episode with. And Dirk van der Wal goes on to explain how promising the future is for Libya now that these militias are supporting a transitional government which is committed to Western ideals, and institution building, and the fact that they have just successfully held an election and supporting a transition government. And he talks about the challenges that still lie ahead for Libya, but says that with the support of the United States, Libya is now on the path of being the most successful country to emerge from the Arab Spring. And all it took was a little nudge, aka 3,000 airstrikes, and the public execution of their former leader.
Well, let's not forget the social media disinformation campaigns leading up to that, right? As far as I recall, and you can call me out if this is wrong, but weren't they one of the actors in the Arab Spring that had those sudden revolutions popped out because of social media banding together?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, all right. So who the fuck was behind that shit? God, I hate the West so much, so deeply.
Yeah, well, you have to wonder, right?
Yeah, and when I say that, I mean those people in institutional power are just such fucking demons,
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I think the Arab Spring was definitely an organic movement, but there's no doubt that its impact or size was propelled by a Western intervention, I'm sure. the social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook played massive roles in that. And you can only imagine the amount of bots at play being generated by some fucking dweeb in a basement at the Pentagon, just making 10,000 accounts per day, like just variations of Muhammad's, or begging to overthrow the leaders, and those same dissident groups that for this whole time leading up to the Arab Spring had been funded by the West would still have been active during those revolutions. Like to assume that the Arab Spring was only like young, disenfranchised, sort of student-aged men, revolutionaries that were just begging for westernization and like liberal reform. Like, sure, there was a lot of that, but those guys can't push the needle far enough without the support of these groups who were reliant on Western funding.
Yeah,
I would imagine.
Within the community I was hanging out in, where I allegedly, potentially met Gaddafi's doctor, there was a pretty wide consensus within that group that they were all, like Western actors in there trying to stir up shit and destabilize the countries, which maybe not. I don't think they'd even have to get people in there to do that. I think you could just kind of like flood a system with propaganda, as we've talked about multiple times.
Absolutely.
This has happened multiple times, that the CIA has like conducted programs in and, tried to do in Cuba with that Cuban Twitter clone that they launched to specifically destabilize the government, which is hilarious. I love Uganda coming out and banning Twitter, by the way.
Did Uganda ban Twitter?
Leading up to the elections, and Twitter released a statement saying that a free and open internet is important to democracy.
Oh,
it was like just after the Capitol riots, and
a free and open internet. You're kidding me.
Yeah. So they were trying to push Uganda to like open up social media, but leading up to them, they just totally like clamped down on it. Hopefully we'll have the foresight to do the same. I mean, it's such a better system to just be like, fucking can the whole thing,
Yeah. That's genius. I love it. Yeah, fucking hell.
Interesting predictions out of this. Now that oil is slowly becoming a less valuable resource and it's in decline, I wonder what the next sort of like big foreign interventions are going to be. If it's like US troops going into Uganda to spread some Twitter democracy,
Yeah, it is an interesting one.
Yeah.
That's a really good question. I feel as though like the low-hanging fruit in terms of these predictions might be like places with lithium reserves, as we saw like the recent US attempt to undermine the results of Bolivia's election in order to gain access to their massive lithium reserves, which is a key component in batteries for storing renewable energy and running electric cars. But I feel as though it's almost too obvious. I think it'll be interesting to see what emerges. So in contradiction to Dirk van der Waal in his article, After Gaddafi, the Surprising Success of the New Libya, a more recent and, in my opinion, far more interesting and accurate article was written by this guy named Matteo Capasso. And the title of this one is called The War and the Economy, the Gradual Destruction of Libya.
Yeah.
And he introduces what I thought was a really fascinating concept, which I had never heard of, which was he calls the accumulation by waste of capital by the West. And he draws the analogy between former colonial relations between the West, like obviously the creators of these colonial empires, which were built on extractive relationships of resources from their colonies to the sort of home states. The obvious example of this is slaves taken from Africa to the West. And he makes the argument that this is perpetuated now by the constant destabilization and waste of countries like Libya. And he contends that the extraction of oil from these places like Libya is far more affordable and easy to do for the West when these countries are in states of disarray. And although right now Libya produces not even a third of what it was pre-intervention or pre-revolution, the oil that does come out of Libya is under the sort of control policy-wise of these Western-backed institutions. And another really interesting point that he makes is that when you have a constant flow of either legal immigrants or refugees leaving these failed states, you have what the media frames as a refugee crisis. But at the same time, you also have a reserve labor pool, which I thought was really interesting.
Nice.
So
yeah.
When you have 2 million Arabs on the doorstep of Europe begging to be let in, suddenly when these Western powers decide that they need them, or they need a sort of demographic adrenaline shot in their states, they might need a cheaper workforce, they might need to diversify growth in certain parts of their country, they can actually just move these groups of people in. So they kind of lay waste to their homeland as a way to like indirectly force these people out. Then you get to place the blame on the state that you laid waste to, as well as the refugees who are, quote, illegally entering your country. And that way you get to hold them in reserve until you need them.
Yeah. Oh, man, that's dark.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah.
And another sort of, and the last point I'll make, which demonstrates this accumulation by waste, is the money that Western exporters make from weapons sales to other states who have their proxy forces fighting in Libya or in support of Libyan forces. So Germany and Italy have recently made billions of dollars exporting weapons to Saudi Arabia and the UAE and other Gulf states, who then in turn send those weapons to their proxy militias, who are all contending for influence in Libya in order to obviously establish a government favorable to those powers. So there's a lot happening, and Van der Waals' prediction that Libya will be a surprising success has been absolutely incorrect. The country's been in a state of turmoil and destruction for a decade now, but there might be some promising news because recently a ceasefire between the main parties fighting for control of Libya has been announced, and the most recent iteration of a transitional government has been established. So we can cross our fingers that, the violence in Libya might stop, but if it happens, it's almost certainly going to be on the terms of the West, which is a shame.
Oh God, how disgusting is that? And I think the problem is like one of the best lessons I ever got was from a economics professor who I normally hold all economics professors in pretty low regard, but this one was personally my favorite. Shout out to you. I forgot your name. I'm sorry. I will try and remember it in future. But she told me that the most important thing to consider is like the context and culture for a successful government or system, and you can't just export bullshit institutions from the West and then just like, even if you have the best of intentions, even if you're not going there for the oil and you like legitimately believe democracy and Western systems of government are going to be the best thing, you can't just take it and plop it down and just assume it's going to work. It doesn't work like that. It's just that you have to understand the nuances of the situation. And when you come from a background of not, you could call them totalitarian or dictators, but frankly, like people who work to unite a fractured society, then you have to work with that. And I think that's like part of what these Middle Eastern leaders are, and especially in like Southeast Asia, you get the same thing. You get guys like Lee Kuan Yew and I don't know, the South Korean general, his name is escaping me, but he was another sort of like could be considered a dictator and ran an authoritarian, totalitarian government, but it was really successful because it worked within the culture, So
exactly, and I don't want to speak on behalf of these other cultures, but I would entertain the idea that in some of these cultures you need a strong man, and that might be a widely accepted idea. Just as in the West we can't fathom the idea of anything but a representative democratic government. it might be that, you know, like the fucking Iraq wanted Saddam Hussein. And sure, like terrible things happened, but a lot of people look back at the Saddam Hussein era as the glory days.
Yeah, I don't, well, better than now, right? Like, I don't think you can just sort of like, you know, and oh man, something that like Tucker Carlson was saying about the Pakistani gender studies program as part of like the Biden bailout. Like maybe they don't want it. Maybe they don't want like the empowerment of the West because it's pretty shitty at the end of the day.
Yeah, of course. He was suggesting that people in Pakistan would look at the riots and the protests and the COVID deaths in the United States on the news and just be like, yeah, Western ideals, no thanks.
Yeah, well, exactly.
Which is, I mean, who could blame them?
Well, there's not the whole like patting on the back that we've done a great job. I think is pretty bullshit. You know, like I don't think we have. I don't think it's much better than any other country. It's controversial opinion, but like
it's. I think it's better than a lot of countries in terms of developmental sort of measured outcomes, such as, you know, GDP or health or
sure, we're doing
average life expectancy, literacy, but it's only on the back of Western violence.
Well, also those are Western indicators. So we're doing well by our own fucking jerk-off metrics, you know?
Yeah.
Like, oh, everybody reads books that we give them as well as we want them to. But, like, man, I don't know. What makes a good life, you know? That's the question. What are you trying to even achieve with all of this shit? Like, everybody in a fucking office job, you know?
A really interesting anecdote that I read about when I was studying international development as a part of my degree was, and the location of this story eludes me because it was a long time ago, but in a traditional African village somewhere in Central Africa, this you know, Western aid organization started going to these remote areas and went into the village and said, like, hey, we're here to help you out and we've got this well building program, so we're going to build a well like right in the middle of your village now. So you're not going to have to walk the 8 kilometers to the well and back every day to get your fresh water. How good is that? And there was like a sort of custom amongst the culture of the people in this place where it was rude to deny offers of help because that was seen as sort of like a friendship or a way that you would build a relationship, and that if they were to reject the offer of assistance from this aid organization, it would reflect poorly on themselves. So this well got built in the middle of this village, and then when this organization was doing like a review of the program or an evaluation, they surveyed a lot of the women in the village, and the women who in these cultures are often the water collectors, were all complaining because the trips to the well and the 1 or 2 hours that they had to spend walking every day to collect water was really important time that they would spend like consolidating bonds between women in their tribe. So women would have time separate from the men of their tribe to discuss womanly or feminine issues. They like, and young girls would spend time with older women, where the older woman would pass down advice and wisdom to younger girls about, you know, how to grow into a woman and what it's like to play the role of a woman in this tribe. And this Western organization completely just disintegrated like this traditional institution amongst that culture. And it's the arrogance of so much of this intervention is like astounding.
I hate it so fucking much. I grew up like reading this economist called Jeffrey Sachs. I can't remember if I've talked about him on the pod or not, but he was essentially the head of or one of the main guys behind the Millennium Development Projects, which was this big goal to go into Africa and help bring them to, you know, Western standards of living. And part of that was this like multi-pronged approach of what he likened to surgical intervention into into an economy where they were putting in
surgical intervention. Even the idea, the wording of that, even based on like Western science, is so fucking infuriating.
Oh, Jeffrey Sachs should be tried. I reckon he's such a pile of shit. But we'll get there. So he went in there and put all these what they call the Millennium Development Villages, where there's like building lots of areas where they could, educate the population because they're fucking not Western smart. They're dumb. And they were going to start growing crops that made money as opposed to crops that they were growing already because, after having lived there for centuries, they're obviously too fucking dumb to be making money. So they need to grow our crops. And then followed with all these other fucking incredibly arrogant interventions. And the Millennium Development Villages, I think Jeffrey Sachs would have touted as a success under his own fucking hubris and definitions of success, but were also widely regarded to be a failure. And there's this really scathing fucking book. God damn, I want to remember the name of it. I'll do a Google search for right now, just because it's so good. So there's a book written about him called The Idealist, and there's two podcasts I reckon people should listen to get a fantastic fucking overview of this motherfucker. And they're both on Econ Talk, which is personally one of my favorite, outside of course, Modern Guilt, one of my favorite podcasts. And so
Modern Guilt, Econ Talk collab coming soon.
Yeah, fucking A. Ross Roberts as a legend. So this journalist called Nina Monk wrote a book about Jeffrey Sachs's work in Africa, and described him as a man who's incredibly smart and driven and idealistic, but also driven by huge amounts of hubris because he has essentially just been propped up by institutions his entire life and told that he's doing a fantastic job and blah blah blah, without considering the fact that he's ruined countries that he's been a direct policy advisor for. And part of what she describes is him flying into Africa in this fancy helicopter and landing to go just basically give orders to people and then flies back out on the helicopter without even fucking considering the people that he's around, and of course getting some nice pictures with Africans to bolster his image and whatnot.
Oh, of course. Got to chuck that on the United Nations Instagram.
Yeah. So it was just I don't know. It was fucking ruthless. And Jeffrey Sachs ends up coming on. So Nina Monk goes on Econ Talk and gives an account of all the shit that she saw going on and how the crops had failed because they weren't cycling them properly, and then even the crops that they were trying to grow within those African villages weren't right for the soil, and also it destroyed their traditional farming techniques, and the education wasn't particularly useful within the context of the area, and it also didn't help the whole it just basically flew in the fucking face of their entire culture and way of being. So Jeffrey Sachs ended up going on Econ Talk shortly after to try and give a rebuttal that was just so fucking hilarious if you listen to the Nina Monk episode, because it's just filled with his cope, his desperate fucking cope.
Yeah, right.
To try and fucking deal with his failure as an economist. But I mean the tragedy is it's ultimately a joke on the fucking people that he was trying to help, because this guy doesn't fucking get it that his institutions and his way of life kind of suck ass. There's so much fucking arrogance to assume that people want to be the same as the West and to think that we have it good beyond.
Absolutely.
Okay, we have these metrics that are ideal, and I'm not gonna, not ideal, sorry, but it's life expectancy being higher surely does sound like a good thing, but man, I would way rather be fucking chilling with we already had this chat, chilling with my bros in the fucking sweatshop than in an office with a bunch of people that I hate, suffering for 40 years of my life than living well for fucking 50, 40 years in the office, 20 years on the fucking streets, and you caught it.
Yeah, while the government just approves like $200 million a year for anti-smoking campaigns to just rob you of your joy.
Yeah. What fucking freedoms as well? Like, oh, the freedom of the West. Oh, it's so free here. Fuck off. Do you know how fucking expensive it is to get a durry? Whereas I could be smoking
fucking
Marlboro Reds for like $1 a pack if I was back in Indo.
Yeah.
Bintangs, as far as the fucking eye can see. Viagra shots, straight at the bar. You know, I could go buy Valium OTC in the fucking pharmacy, and as much pseudoephedrine to make my eyes fucking pop out of my skull. Whereas here, it's like, I have to get a fucking prescription to get melatonin. What freedom do I have, you know?
Yeah.
Monday morning rants. At least I have the freedom to vote for my party that won't get in. Yeah, thank fuck for that.
The freedom to take out a mortgage that'll put you in 40 years of debt.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's...
forcing you to be a wage laborer for the rest of your life.
Yeah, thank fuck for that freedom that I love. Or, you know, all the institutional education that I have had to, like, actively unlearn for years and years and years. That is, like, subsequently revealed itself to be complete bogus and bullshit. Like, university being a productive career path. Despite the fact that nobody's released the actual stats on that as like an eroding path for the bulk of people that go, you know? There's so much arrogance. It's one of those things that, like, as you can tell by my emotional rant there, that drives me up the fucking wall, because these motherfuckers sitting around, you know, getting paid $200,000 a year to tell the rest of the world how good they have it and how good we have it in the West, who are just completely ignorant, is mind-boggling.
Yeah, and the more recent iteration of what you were describing with the Millennium Development Goals are now the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So it's like the revamped edition, but with climate responsibility added.
Yeah.
So now it's like,
right, they really care about that.
Yeah, now it's like aid organizations not only go to Africa to tell them how to live their lives, but also how to be environmentally friendly. As if they haven't been the stewards of their own environments for millennia already.
Yeah.
And are now only dealing with the environmental destruction of Western fucking industry.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's like like they colonize a place, strip it of all its wealth and resources, and turn it into a wasteland.
Yeah.
Then give it independence, and in order to help it develop, you put a bunch of Western factories there, and then you realize that the pollution being caused by the factories pouring into the surrounding environment is negatively impacting crop yields. So then you implement another program to fucking fix that, and it's like that fucking children's song, like this old lady swallows a fly and then swallows the spider to eat the fly and then swallows some other shit to eat the spider. It's a fucking joke.
Yeah. That's hilarious. Yeah. You know, one of the things that always caught me off guard, I know, just this is probably be a stupid anecdote for a lot of you, but for at the time I was like, loved being up for 48 hours, and you can take from that what you will. But like, one of the things that always got me is, like, I'd go to clubs there and there'd be these amazing 4-story high, like, dens of hedonism that just, you know, earthly delights were on every fucking floor, and you could essentially just, like, it just still blows my mind to this day that sort of shit exists. It's what I imagine, like, being in a Roman orgy would have been like back in the day. It's just like actual hedonistic pleasure. And within them, they'd be playing these videos of European clubs, and you'd be sitting there thinking, like, bro, not European clubs, sorry. I mean, like, Western clubs, like, you know, Americans dancing around this club. And I'd always think, like, buddy, if you fucking knew how depressing it was back in a bar at home, you don't know how fucking good you've got it. Like, when I go out, and I don't even go out here because it's so fucking shit, but, like, you know, going out for a beer here where everybody's standing on, like, some sort of fucking year 8 formal, you know, like, woman on one side of the room and the men on the other. nobody's like interacting, and there's all these like restrictions on what you can do. It's just, yeah. We should do a reverse thing where we start bringing their culture over here. Yeah, make it more interesting.
We really should, man.
Yeah.
And I mean, the one of the great ironies of the whole Western development campaign, or neo-colonialism, is that we can't wait to take stuff like exotic food back to the West.
Yeah.
We want to strip all of the best parts of their culture out, import it to the West, and think that they want us to do the same thing for them.
Yeah, but they want to fucking neuter it as well, you know?
Yeah, like, straight up, yeah. Water down the spices in the curry.
Yeah. Butter chicken is like the ultimate metaphor for like, taking beautiful culture and just like fucking pissing on it and turning it into like the butter chicken. We have like the butter chicken of the fucking, of all those beautiful cultures, and they get our fucking democracy. At least they didn't get our office jobs. That's coming next.
Oh, yeah. I mean, fucking, they have worse versions of our office jobs even. Like, think about call centers in the Philippines, man, you know?
Yeah. I hope they can at least smoke inside there. That'd be like...
Yeah.
The moment they take that away, it's just going to be like a true fucking dystopian nightmare.
In some bleak fantasies that I've had, I've actually wondered if like working in a call center would be that bad. I know that sounds insane, but I sometimes like wonder if you could just like embrace the suffering
I used to do
and the monotony and just resign yourself to the fact that like, yeah, man, I have to just come here and not think at all.
Yeah.
I have to just have a thing on and just basically plug into a machine for 8 hours. Just like have 2 breaks, 2 smokos.
I find it kind of fun, man. It's like nowhere near... Okay, so I've had like maybe 25, maybe 30 jobs, but probably around like mid-20. Like, I've had a lot of fucking jobs. And I'd have to say, of the jobs I've worked, call center wasn't so bad. Like, it was pretty funny. I worked with like a bunch of like super fucking like bitchy men and women who would just bitch to me like on Smoko about just, I don't know, like the drama of their life, which was always reasonably entertaining. And aside from that, you just sit there and get like told to fuck off by half the phone calls, and then get weird like emotional phone calls from the other ones, and occasional people who are super stoked with you. It's like an interesting slice of life, I feel.
Yeah, it would be.
One of the best movies I've seen was this 24-hour film called Clock, I think it is, or Time Clock, whatever. I don't know. It was in, like, when I was living in Melbourne, I went to this art show and they had this 24-hour movie that shows the exact time matched to the time of the day. And it's just like a cut-up of movies. And it turns into this really interesting slice of life. You're getting like a little cutscene into fucking every single person's life at that one particular moment. And people will pick up the phone and just like tell you exactly what's going on in their life. Like, I can't fucking talk now. My husband's cheating on me. My son's in trouble. And that bitch across the road has been letting her dog shit on my fucking lawn again. All right? So no, I don't have time for a survey. But what's it about? It's like fucking cancer, or like, do you want to like donate to cancer or something? Oh, maybe we could chat for a little bit. Like, it's really cool. It's fucking more interesting than sitting around on Excel all day. So
yeah, I bet. Yeah. Do you want to talk about vaccines?
On that fucking tangent. Yeah, sure. So
while we're talking about Western exceptionalism.
Well, this is funny. You sent me an article written by Global Times China. I don't know who they are, but
That's Chinese state media.
Is it? Yeah, it's good. It was really entertaining to read. I couldn't see the article. It's an opinion piece, and it's just titled by Global Times, so, whatever. And it starts off detailing the 23 elderly Norwegian people who died after receiving Pfizer vaccines. 13 assessed and common side effects may have been contributed to severe reactions in them, according to Norwegian Medicines Agency. I actually saw an article on Reuters that talks about the same thing. So, you know, I don't know if Reuters falls under like general Western media. Maybe not. They're like reasonably impartial most of the time, I feel. So, whatever. But essentially, this was like a total fucking hit piece on the West. It's hilarious. It's like real fucking scathing the way that they attack the West. Like, let me try and find a quote. A lot of it was talking about like how the mRNA vaccine that Pfizer put out is relatively untested, and which it kind of is, and you know how it's putting a lot of people at risk, but they're essentially betting on the fact that it's going to be better than a lot of the deaths that might occur from COVID. So, you know, it's a weird little bet that's going on. But it might be a catastrophic bet that's going on. But they're also ignoring Chinese vaccines that are based on, you know, proven methods that have, you know, decades of research behind them. So, in terms of the COVID-19 vaccines, Chinese society and the Chinese government have regarded science and objectivity as priorities in practical and realistic manner. China has squarely faced the reality that Chinese vaccines lack sufficient data. Chinese COVID-19 vaccines have been put on the market but are conditional. Vaccination priority will be given to high exposure populations, yada, yada, yada. No senior Chinese official has come out to openly endorse Chinese vaccines. So I thought that was like reasonably interesting. You know, I didn't realize they were being so sort of like cautious about the vaccines, which is quite cool because we're certainly not doing that whatsoever. Watch Biden get his vaccine live.
Yeah.
On Twitch.
Are they doing that?
No, but I mean...
Oh, that would be so... It sounds like fucking they would.
AOC and the squad live on Twitch answering your questions about the COVID-19 vaccine. It's like almost... It's not even funny because it's so fucking realistic. Just...
Yeah, for sure.
Anyway, they go on like, however, the Pfizer vaccine has been strongly promoted by the U.S. administration and capital. Their potential risk has been deliberately downplayed by Western public opinion, and public opinion has created an impression that Pfizer's mRNA vaccine, which is being used for the first time, is safer than the Chinese vaccine. Regrettably, Washington has promoted China-US confrontation, and the US and its major allies have initiated their ideological frenzy. Is there any justice? They believe it is right to suppress China and wrong to be fair to China. It's like being back at the call center. Anyway, I found this sort of stuff interesting because last year I was studying, I was doing an economic master's thesis on clinical trials and whatnot. So I was thinking, oh, okay, that's a reasonably interesting article. It's funny to see China coming out and writing bitchy hit pieces on the West, which frankly, we need more of all the time because they're just such fucking good reads, you know? And I was like, I'll look into the clinical trials and see what sort of data is there. You know, because I'd be interested to take what I've fucking studied and see if there's any application. So I couldn't find any real results on the like FDA's website. So normally, like, you know, something goes through a phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trial. And each of those are for different things. The phase 1 is effectively to just make sure that it like doesn't kill rats, I think, or it might be tested in people, but it's like you're essentially just checking that there's some reaction of some kind and the thing actually will work compared to placebo. And then phase 2 is to make sure it's like not gonna fucking, you know, like kill people the moment it has it. So it's like a really small population. And then phase 3 is more about efficacy against previous drugs. So you're making sure that it's better than alternatives, which is kind of like irrelevant. I guess, you know, you could measure it in comparison to existing treatments for COVID-19 to make sure it's better than them, but I don't really know how they do it. So the FDA hasn't actually approved anything, but they've cleared it for emergency use. So for the next 2 years, they're going to be actually studying it, and then the FDA would probably approve it, provided it passes its, like, you know, presumed you know, requirements for getting efficacy. And I would say the FDA is reasonably legit. They don't really fuck around when it comes to this sort of thing. and have so far been somewhat ideologically neutral, I would say, personally, just from what I've seen. But the actual journal article where they tout their evidence for the Pfizer vaccine was like pretty fucking like shitty, I reckon. After reading it, I'll just try and bring it up. I actually had it up in full. We can link it and people can also make their own conclusion. But the whole 95% vaccine efficacy statement that you'll see thrown around everywhere, from what I read, and please weigh in if I'm wrong, I'm sure I am, because I don't fucking care enough to read this deeply, because I'm frankly not really interested in taking it for 2 years anyway. Is the 95% efficacy thing comes from the fact that like 8 people who had the vaccine developed COVID-19 after getting the vaccine, and 160 people who were on placebo got COVID-19 after it. And that's where it comes from, which I found a little fucking weird that,
Can you explain that again, sorry?
So when they're trying to measure efficacy and they're trying to say like how, like, does this shit actually work? The metric that they're using is how many people develop COVID-19 symptoms after getting the vaccine. So, because I wasn't sure how they did this. I was thinking like, oh, did they like get the vaccine and then expose everyone to COVID-19 and see how they like react to it or something? Or, I don't know how they would do it. And I don't know what standard vaccine clinical trials would also be like. But what they said is that so they gave 2 doses of the vaccine to everyone, and 2 doses of placebo to everyone as well. I don't know if it was like a 50-50 split between who was doing it, but it was probably something close to that. And the people who had the placebo, 7 days after they were given it, 169 of them, so this is 45,000 people, split in 2. Half of them got the vaccine, half of them got the placebo. 169 people who got the placebo, 7 days after placebo, got COVID-19.
Yeah.
8 people who had the vaccine got COVID-19. Therefore, they're saying it's 95% effective against COVID-19, which seems like a weird extrapolation.
So much room for variation.
Well, yeah, exactly, right. Because like
it depends on the lifestyle of those people, where they commute to, who they come into contact with.
Yeah.
All that kind of shit that would determine whether or not you would get COVID.
Yeah, exactly. So when I read that, I was thinking like, what? That's a little flaky. One of the fascinating things about clinical trials is they are all pretty flaky. Like they are way less set in stone than you think they are, and just because the like horrendousness of actually trying to test a drug is really difficult. It's not as straightforward as like take a pill and then your symptoms are gone and then we're going to say this is good, because every single person has a unique reaction to something. Like if you give 200,000 people in the population a carrot, one of them might die of anaphylactic shock or something. One of them might choke on it. One of them might take the carrot and then develop cancer within 2 years. And it's not actually very straight. So a lot of what they do is they look at like, compared to the normal population and incidences of cancer, choking, whatever, death, what is it higher within the people that got the vaccine or the drug or the carrot, or is it lower compared to it? And that's also part of like how they measure up against it. But that data isn't actually released as far as I'm aware. So they have like adverse events at the moment, which is like people got tired, some people have an anaphylactic shock, which is always going to happen. It's just normal when you expose people to, shit. Some people are always going to have a weird reaction to it. But the longer term adverse effects is the more interesting stuff. So this happened very recently, and it was one of the things that I was actually going to be studying as part of this thesis that I dropped out of because I didn't want to do it in the end. But it was to do with the dengue fever vaccine called Dengvaxia, I think is how you pronounce it. And it was within the Philippines, a Dengvaxia is essentially a vaccine to treat dengue fever that has since gone on and got FDA approval. But it like also potentially may have killed like 600 people in the Philippines, and they've banned it now in the Philippines. Ooh. Yeah, so the dengue fever virus works by, it fucks a lot of people up. You get it from a mosquito. They call it like breakbone fever, and you're effectively like laid out for 2 weeks. It doesn't actually have a high incidence of death. I think it's like pretty low. It's like 0.0003 or something like that. So 0.03% or something is the number of people that die from it, or it might be lower than that. It's basically like more likely to fuck you up as opposed to actually kill you.
Yeah.
But people who get it, so if you get it the first time, you generally, you're okay. If you get it the second time, then you can have this massive reaction to the dengue fever virus and die subsequently, because your body goes into like a basically freaks out and over produces antibodies against it, and then shuts down afterwards. And that's part of what was happening with this vaccine, is that people who had received one dose of the vaccine had developed antibodies against it. And then when they got the virus, their body freaked the fuck out and had like a horrendous reaction to the dengue fever vaccine and then died, which led to so many people dying, And it's one of those things that the Science Mag and NPR, of all people, which is, this was pre-COVID, because there's no way NPR would run this fucking story now. But NPR released this thing talking about it. This rush to produce and sell the vaccine within the Philippines had led to a lot of people dying. So they say, within this, I think they say directly can be attributable to the vaccine is 185 kids, but potentially more people. And the health minister in charge had resigned over the controversy because it was so intense. And a lot of it is to do with the fact that there was just real pressure to release the fucking vaccine, despite that there was concern within the medical community that releasing it too fast might, be jumping the gun a little bit, and we might not see like some of the more severe reactions that could happen within it.
Yeah, man. Fuck.
Yeah. So, would I buy puts on Pfizer? Because, the only thing worth considering is whether or not you're gonna like bet against this, or whether you're gonna buy it. I don't know.
I would still say no, because like even though that Global Times article is Chinese state media, they make a great point that like vaccines have been turned into political weapons now.
Yeah.
So like for the same reason the West, wouldn't entertain the idea of using Sinovac, the Chinese vaccine, or Sputnik 5, the Russian vaccine. It's the same reason that they won't stop using Pfizer, I'd imagine. They're not going to undermine their own projects.
Well, Pfizer's so big as well. Like they're not some fucking... If there was a biotech company, and there is, and if you are a Patreon subscriber, you'll hear more about it. If there's a biotech company that's betting on a vaccine at the moment entirely, and that's like their main thing, and they're trying to rush it to get across the line, it's a risky bet, and you're effectively going to be betting on one, I think, the fact that Pfizer won't be able to meet its supply to get the vaccine out. Two, the fact that the Pfizer vaccine might be like really bad, because you're right, like if we think about the incidence of bad reactions here, it would have to be pretty widespread to cut through the fucking political bullshit that we're seeing right now. Like a lot of people dying and attributable to the vaccine. If like...
Absolutely.
Even 1% of everybody suddenly develops, I don't know, like a chronic fatigue syndrome or adverse reactions to some other virus off the back of this or something, that wouldn't be enough almost to fucking break through the bullshit that we're seeing right now, without getting labeled an anti-vaxxer and alt-right supporter or whatever the fuck else they're throwing at people questioning,
It's quite interesting, the idea of like a vaccine passport that's being floated around now, right?
Yeah.
So like Australia and Europe, I know, are definitely considering implementing something like that. So like you will need to provide evidence that you've had a vaccine to be able to travel now.
Yeah.
And it's going to be interesting to see what sort of price people will place on their ability to travel, regardless of their suspicion.
Yeah, well, that's it, really. And where this whole vaccine debate's going to get into. The World Health Organization was the main body pushing the Denvaxia vaccine into the Philippines.
Yeah, right.
A vaccine panel at the World Health Organization concluded in 2016 that Denvaxia was safe for children 9 or under, despite concerns from people within the Filipino health community against the Denvaxia vaccine. Once again, showing us just fuck the World Health Organization, who now recommends the vaccine can only be used after a test to be made sure that the children has had at least one brush with dengue first.
Speaking of the WHO, I just came across an article as I was sort of like half consciously scrolling. A catastrophic moral failure. WHO chief condemns vaccine rollout. Director General Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus kicked off WHO's week-long executive board meeting virtually from its headquarters in Geneva by lamenting that one poor country received a mere 25 vaccine doses while over 39 million doses have been administered in nearly 50 richer nations. So Guinea in West Africa has only received 25 doses, and the WHO are having a big cry about it from their virtual headquarters in Geneva, Switzerland, where I bet they've all had vaccines.
Can they get fucked? I hope that they just fade into irrelevance like they should have done on Inception. Oh well, fuck them. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how all this comes together, right? Like, I can't imagine that, I don't know, there might be adverse events, there might not be. You don't know. That's the thing. You don't know until the shit's like fucking out, until it's been tested, till people have like gone and lived and experienced what it's like to, encountered other pathogens. And
exactly.
And until then, it's just kind of like, well, yeah, the shit's risky. And there have been cases where, and that might be particular to dengue fever, but again, you don't know. So, hold Pfizer, not a sell rating, not a buy either.
So, for our listeners, if you are interested in hearing a little bit more about one particular biotech company in the United States that goes by the name of Oxygen, who may or may not have a stake in this vaccine scenario, you should subscribe to our Patreon. If you go to patreon.com/modern guilt, you can subscribe to our exclusive monthly podcasts where we will be doing monthly deep dives on stocks that for one reason or other are hot on people's lips at the moment. And we'll be researching the stock ourselves, as well as getting our head around research done by others, and then trying to provide a really very detailed overview, including our own personal positions on it. So that's $5 a month to support the podcast and get some exclusive content. If you subscribe as well, then we'll offer the opportunity to make suggestions for stocks that you'd like us to do a deep dive into as well, so that if you've got questions or thoughts about a particular stock, then you can throw it our way and we'll weigh it up and give it back to you. So
dope.
We can wrap this up for today.
Yeah, all right.
Please, if you want another way to support us, follow us on Instagram at Modern Guilt Pod. Follow us on Twitter, guilt_modern, or email us modernguiltpod@gmail.com. That's us for today. We will be dropping another episode next week, as well as our exclusive Patreon episode on Oxygen. So take care. I hope you learned something. We're done. Bye.
Peace.